Howdy folks. In this video we're going to look at how current row filtering, also known as context transition, works when you are using the calculate revisor inside of an iterator. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? I'm here in filter revisors part 1.xosx and I'm in the calc current row tab, right? And here we've got some code that has both the calculate function and it's inside of an iterator, which means we're going to be performing current row filtering. So what are we doing here? So we're going to ask it to do something we've done many times before with a slight twist. So we're going to use the average X iterator, right, which is going to get a temp table, add a column to it, and average the results, right? The temp table that we're going to add the column to is based on this derivation right here. Go get all the visible values of the shift column. And if you'll notice when we start out, we have no filters in place, so it should just be both lunch and dinner. Okay, that's also pretty easy. Where it gets tricky, right, different than what we've done many times before, is the definition of our expression column has a bunch more stuff in it. Right, so in earlier videos it was very simple. Here the expression column definition is pretty big, and importantly it's got this revisor at the very tip top of it. So the first thing in the expression column definition is this revisor, this calculate function right there. So we're going to see how that affects everything. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Let's start with the easy stuff, right? So average X, it's going to get a temp table, add a column to it. The temp table that it's going to get is here argument 1, this derivation right here, all the visible values of shift. Again, no filters in the filter context. So what are all the visible values of shift? Well, there's both lunch and dinner. So let's go ahead. Oh, wait, I've already got it right there. How about that? Let's pretend like I didn't have that already filled out. So what would I do, right? So if I'm going to go get all the visible values of the shift column, well, it's lunch and dinner. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to type in shift. And I'm going to have both lunch and dinner, right? Thought I'd check that. Guess not. Okay, so we've derived, for the first time, I promise, all the visible values of lunch and dinner, right there. So that's that bit of our code right there. Now we're going to add this column to it, right? So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to type in EXP, and I've actually already got a bunch of this stuff already filled out for me, right? So I'm going to hit enter, and what we'll notice is for every single cell here for this expression column, we have a bunch of stuff. So that and that corresponds to this whole big block of text. So it's going to run this big block twice, once for each row, right? That's what an iterator does. Okay, so let's start here with the very first row, this cell right here, if you want to think of it like a cell. I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to just go ahead and highlight this, remind ourselves this is the first one we're going to do. We're going to do this twice. And so this corresponds to this block of code, right? Right there. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight this as well. Okay, so we're going to do this yellow bit of code twice, once for each row, and we're going to start with the first row. Okay, so what's in there? What are we going to do? Well, the very first thing we see is a revisor, specifically the calculate function, right? So what this is going to say is we want to revise the filters and then run a subexpression. And whenever you see a revisor, in particular calculate, right, you need to with your eyes freeze the subexpression to remind yourself that it's only going to run after we revise the filters, right? So I'm going to go ahead and select the subexpression, which is argument 1 of calculate. This is the bit that's going to run after we revise the filters, and I'm going to freeze it to remind myself that it's not going to run yet, right? Can't run yet. We haven't revised the filters. So I'm going to freeze it. Brr, it's in a big block of ice. Okay, so now calculate's going to revise the filters, then it can unfreeze this and run it. Okay, so how's it going to revise the filters? Well, it's going to try and do two things, right? It's going to perform current row filtering, right? And if there's any override filters, it'll add those as well, okay? So let's start with the first bit, adding current row filters, right? So also known as context transition. So are there any values of the current row? Well, yeah, there's a value for shift equals lunch. So calculate is going to take that value for shift equals lunch and add it to the filter context. Let's go ahead and kind of emulate that. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to type in shift equals lunch, right? So now calculate's going to take a temp table that looks like this and add it to the filter context. So I'm going to click on this, I'm going to left click and drag, and I'm going to hold down control to make a copy, right? It's actually a bit more accurate to say it moves it rather than it copies it, but I kind of want to see it both there and there, so I'm going to make a copy. Okay, so we've added a filter for shift equals lunch, right? And now it's going to ask, okay, are there any override filters? Well, if there were override filters, calculate would have more than one argument, right? That'd be arguments 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those would be all the override filters, but there aren't any. In this particular instance, calculate only has one argument, which is the subexpression. So there's no override filters, so we don't have to add any additional override filters. Okay, good. So we've added any values of the current row as filters. We performed current row filtering, also known as context transition. There are no override filters provided in the code, therefore we don't have to worry about those. Good. We're done revising the filters. So let's go ahead and filter down to just lunch. Just lunch. Go ahead, click OK. Boom, good. Okay, so now we've got a filter context with shift equals lunch. We're done revising the filters. Calculate's done revising the filters. We can now unfreeze this sub-expression and run it in this new filter context. So I'm going to go ahead and find that, sort of change the color from that frozen color. I'm going to make it kind of this light gray. Okay, so we've unfrozen the sub-expression because we're done revising the filters. Now I can go ahead and run the sub-expression, which is going to go get all the visible rows of mini, add this column to it, and sum up the results. Easy, easy. So I'm going to go ahead and select this stuff right there. Control-C to copy. Come down over here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values, or hit the V key, and hit OK. Okay, good. So now I've derived all the visible rows of mini. That's what that little bit of code right there does, which gets passed into an iterator, which is going to add this column to it and sum up the results. And I've actually got most of that hard work done. So I'm going to type in EXP right here. And when I hit enter, we'll see that all the hard work is already done, right? For every single row, we have this definition, get the units for that row. So for there, we get 2. For there, we get 1. For there, we get 1. And for there, we get 3. So we get the units for each row. And what do we do with the results? We sum them up because this is the sumx function. So 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 3 equals 7. Good. So that 7 is what the calculate function is going to return. So I'm going to go ahead and click right down here. Type in 7, which is going to be the answer for this particular cell. But I'm not quite done. I'm not quite done with this cell yet, right? We've returned that 7, but calculate is a good roommate. And by that, I mean it cleans up after itself when it's done. So it created this revised filter context within which it was going to run this sub-expression right there. But now it's done running the sub-expression. We got the number 7 that we wanted. It's going to reset the filter context back to the way it was when it found it. So I'm going to click on this little patch of orange right there. Control-C to copy. Control-V to paste. Okay, so we've set the filters back to the way they were. We no longer have that filter for lunch. We're looking at both of them. Now we're actually done with this cell. So I'm going to right-click there, change that to no fill, and we can focus on the next cell, the next row. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to highlight this one. And we're going to do the exact same thing, right? We're going to do this once per row in our table. That's what an iterator does, right? So it's the same big block of code right there, but now for this row. Okay, good. So what do we do in this row? Well, it should sound pretty familiar. We're going to run this code, and the first thing in the code, right, is the calculate function. The calculate is a revisor, so whenever you see any revisor, calculate in particular, you need to freeze that sub-expression with your eyeballs, right? And remind yourself this is only going to run after we've revised the filters, right? Because there's no point in revising it yet. The filters are all wrong. They're empty. We need to add a filter for something, for dinner, actually, okay? Speaking of which, right? Calculate's going to revise the filters, right? Then run the sub-expression. How's it going to revise the filters? Well, it's going to start by performing current row filtering, right? Also known as context transition. Look for values of the current row and add them as filters. Are there any values in the current row? Yeah, shift equals dinner. Okay, good. Well, so calculate's going to perform current row filtering and add a filter for shift equals dinner, just like this. Shift, dinner. There we go. So now calculate's going to add this to the filter context. Click and drag. I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy. More accurate to say it moves it, but I'm just going to make a copy so that way I can see it both there and there. Good. So now, now we've performed current row filtering. Calculate, since it's a revisor, it's going to ask, are there any override filters? Well, we only have the one argument, right, which is the sub-expression. If there were arguments 2, 3, 4, and 5, those would be, 2, 3, 4, and 5 override filters. Well, there aren't any here, so there are no override filters. So we've performed current row filtering. We've taken any value of the current row, added as a filter. If there were override filters, we would have added them, but there aren't any, so we don't have to worry about that. We are now done revising the filters. Let's go filter down to dinner. Filter down to dinner. Click OK. Okay. So now we're filtered down to dinner. I can go ahead and unfreeze this sub-expression and run it because we've got the new filter context in place. So I'm going to right-click on this. Unfreeze it. Get out of that big block of ice. Put that gray color there. That looks pretty good. Okay. So now we go get all the visible rows of mini, add this column to it, sum up the results. Select all the visible rows of mini, right? Which are different because now we're in a filter context for shift equals dinner. I come down here, I Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values, hit OK. And now I've derived the temp table with all the visible rows of mini. I'm going to add this column to it and sum up the results. In fact, I've already done that. So I come over here, I type in EXP. I should say I've already got it ready, right? And so here I'm going to do it. I click OK. Just like that, it adds a column where for every single row we get the units. 2, 1, 2. And we sum them up because it's a SumX function. So 2 plus 1 plus 2 equals 5. And that is what the calculate function returns. That's what the calculate function returns. But it's not done yet, right? Because calculate is a good roommate, just like all revisers. Good roommates all, right? It's going to clean up after itself. It's going to clean up after itself. So we revise the filters to add a filter for shift equals enter so that it could run this subexpression in that new filter context. Now calculate's going to set it back to the way it found it, right? So we're going to go ahead, click on this little eraser patch here, that little bit of orange, Control-C to copy, and Control-V to paste, right? That's just my little way of erasing that filter from the filter context. Okay, good. So now we're done. We're done with that particular cell right there. No, that particular cell right there, so I don't need any fill right there, right? And we're done running our, adding our expression column. We've done it for every single row in that table. So I can go ahead and unhighlight this as well. Unhighlight this as well. Okay, there we go. Okay, good. So now we've gotten all the values of shift, right? We've added a column to it, or an expression column with this definition, and we've gotten 7 and 5. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to average the result because that's what the average x function does. So now for the last little bit of our trick, I'm going to do equals average. I click on average. There we go. I hit tab because clicking wasn't working. I go ahead and average those, and what do I get? I get 6. You probably could have done that in your head. 7 and 5 average together equals 6. But sure enough, that's what I get, which is the average units per shift, right? Okay, good. So let's go ahead and do one more example. Let's go do one more example. I'm going to scroll down here a little ways. And it's going to kind of be the same thing. I'm going to use the same sub-expression because frankly, it's kind of easy. But this time we're going to do it over all the dishes, right? So before, up here it was all the different shifts. We got a table of all the shifts and added the expression column to it and averaged it. Now we're going to get a temp table with all the dishes, add the same expression column to it, and average the results. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that, right? So average x is going to get a temp table, add a column to it, average the results. The temp table is this derivation right there, which is all the visible values of dish. And just like last time, we're going to start with an empty filter context. Oh gosh, I forgot to reset the filters. I erased it there, but I didn't reset it here. Let me go ahead and reset it real quick. Sorry about that. Sorry if that was distracting. I apologize. Should have done that. Okay. Bad. Okay. Hopefully I'll do it right this time, right? I've got 3 chances this time to do it right. Okay, so we're going to go get all the dishes, and right now there's no filters in place, and we can actually see all the rows of menu with no filters in place. Good for me, right? So what are all the dishes? Well, we've got pasta, burger, and salad. So let's go ahead and get that temp table. Dish, pasta, burger, and salad. There we go. And we are going to add an expression column to it, because that's what the average x function does, right? And the definition of this expression column is this whole block of code right here, this whole thing, okay? So we're going to do this big block 1, 2, 3 times, 1 for each row. That's what an iterator does. Okay, so let's think about this first cell right there. I'm going to go ahead and highlight it. I know there's a lot of colors on here. There's a lot of stuff to keep track of, though. So we're gonna go think about this cell first. So that cell is going to run this big block right there. It's going to run specifically rows 3 through 10. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight those 2. So we're going to run that block for that cell right there, okay? So what's the first thing in that block of code? Well, it's a revisor. It's the calculate function, right? And so anytime you see the calculate function or any revisor, you need to freeze the sub-expression with your eyes, right? Or in your mind's eye, I guess. So we're only going to run this after we revise the filter. So I'm going to freeze this to remind myself of that. So I'm going to right-click and go find a nice, cool color. So it's like in a big block of ice. There we go. Okay. So here's the sub-expression. It's frozen. It's only going to run after we revise the filters. So let's go ahead and revise the filters, and then we can run it. So calculate's going to say, before I can run this, I need to create a new filter context. And there's 2 steps. The first step is performing current row filtering, adding any current values, any values of the current row, I should say. Or are there any values to the current row? Yeah, sure. Dish equals pasta. Okay. So I'm going to type in dish equals pasta. And I'm going to go ahead and add that. And I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy of it. Boom. Okay, so we've performed current row filtering, adding any values to the current row as a filter, also known as context transition. And now we're going to see, we're going to ask, are there any override filters? If the calculate function had additional arguments, like arguments 2, 3, 4, and 5, those would be override filters that we would add. But calculate right now just has the one argument, which is the subexpression right there. So there's no override filters. So we've performed current row filtering. There are no override filters, so we don't have to add them, which means we are done revising the filter. So let's go filter down to pasta and see what the model looks like if we're looking at just pasta. Boom. Okay, good. So now we've created a new revised filter context. Calculate says, good. I've got my revised filter context ready. I can go ahead and unfreeze this subexpression. Speaking of which, Calculate goes out and gets the blowtorch or the hairdryer, whichever one, or the toaster, I guess. However it wants to unfreeze this block of code. It unfreezes it, right? And now it can run it in this new revised context. So go get all the rows of mini, add this column to it, sum up the results. Okay, so here's mini. Notice we're just looking at pasta rows, right? That should make sense at this point. So I select those, Control-C to copy, come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special, click on values or hit the V key, both do the same thing, right? I hit OK, boom. So I've derived my temp table. That's that bit of code right there, all the visible rows of mini. Now we pass it to the SumX iterator, which is going to add an expression column to it with that definition right there, and sum up the results. And I've already done all the hard work. So I'm going to type in EXP, and just like as soon as I hit the enter button, boom, we'll see that I've already got my expression column ready. It's populated, right? And so for every single row, we get the units. So we get 2 right there, we get 1 right there, and we get 2 right there. And we sum up the results because this is the SumX function. So 2 plus 1 plus 2 equals 5. Good, so this 5 is actually the answer to that cell right there, right? It's what calculate function returns. So I'm going to go ahead and hit 5 and hit enter, right? But calculate's not quite done yet. It's gone ahead and returned the value, but because it's a good roommate, it's going to clean up after itself, right? It created this new revised filter context within which it ran the subexpression. It doesn't need it anymore, so it's going to go set the filters back to the way it found them, okay? Specifically, we're going to remove that filter for dish equals pasta. So I'm going to click there on that little patch of orange, Control-C to copy it, and Control-V to paste. That's my way of erasing that filter from the filter context. Okay, good. So now we're done with that row. I'm going to go ahead and erase the highlighting there. Don't need that anymore. And I'm going to focus on this cell right here. And we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to do it for that cell, right? Same lines of code, 3 through 10, but now for this row. Okay. Speaking of which, in lines 3 through 10, what's the first thing we see? Well, you should be pretty familiar with this at this point. The first thing in that definition for the expression column is the calculate function, which is a revisor, right? So anytime you see a revisor, you need to freeze the subexpression in your mind's eye and remind yourself it's only going to run after we revise the filter. So here's the subexpression. This is what will run in the filters once we've revised them, but I have to freeze it right now because the filters haven't been revised yet. So I'm going to go ahead and click up here and give it this nice cool color. It's like it's in a big block of ice. Good. So calculate's going to say, all right, I need to revise the filter. So I'm going to perform current row filtering, and if there are any override filters, I'm going to add them. So current row filtering first, also known as context transition, right? What are we going to do? We're going to find the values for the current row. Well, we have a value for dish equals burger, so we're going to go ahead and add that as a filter. So I'm going to click down here. I'm going to type in dish equals burger, right? And calculate will add that as a filter. Calculate will add that as a filter, assuming I could successfully click on it, which, 50-50. All right, there we go. So I'm going to take that. I'm going to move it up here. I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy of it. Again, it's more accurate to say that it moves it into the filter context, but I like seeing it both there and there. Okay, good. So we've performed current row filtering, right? We've taken the value of the current row and added it as a filter. And if there were any override filters in our code, any additional arguments to calculate, we would now add them. But thankfully for us, right, because we're already running a little long on time, there are no additional arguments for calculate, so we don't have to worry about that. There are no override filters. So we've added any current row values as filters, done that bit. If there were override filters, we would have added them. There aren't. So now we've done both of our steps. We are now done revising the filters, so we can, oh gosh, I messed up again. Whatever. Let's set this back, and let's go look at burgers. Go look at burgers. Okay. Did that twice. So I got one more chance to get this right. 2 more chances to get this right. Okay. So when I erased the filters, I should have set this back if you're not catching on. I don't think it's going to mess us up too bad. Okay, so good. So now we're just looking at burgers. We're just looking at burgers. And so what are we going to do? Well, we can unfreeze the subexpression. Unfreeze the subexpression right there. I'm going to go ahead and make that light gray color. And we can run it. Calculate's going to run the subexpression in this new revised filter context with now a filter for dish equals burgers, which is why we're just looking at burgers right now. Okay, so let's go get all the visible rows of mini, right? Because that's what that bit says right there. Go get all the visible rows of mini, add that column to it, sum up the results. Control-C to copy. Come down here. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Oops. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Values. Click OK. There we go. Okay. So now I got all those guys. Now what I want to do is I want to add a column to it where I get all the units and sum up the results. And as you would have guessed, that's already done. So I just type in EXP. I hit enter, and boom, we get the 1 for the first row, 3 for the second row, 2 for the third row. If we take 1 plus 3 plus 2, we get 6 right there, right? So this 6 is the actual answer for that particular row. So I'm going to go ahead and type in 6, but I'm not quite done yet. I'm not quite done yet. Calculate is a good roommate, and so it's going to clean up after itself. It created this new revised filter context to run this sub-expression in, right? But it's done running it. It got the answer 6, so now it's got to set the filters back to the way it found it, right? So speaking of which, I'm going to click on that little patch of orange right there, Control-C, and click over here and do Control-V to paste. That's me erasing that filter. And hey, you know what else? I'm actually going to set this back the way I should have done last time. Okay, so now the filter context is empty. Let's go ahead and make that visually apparent up there. So now we should be looking at all 3 of these. Sorry for that little mistake. Okay, good. So now we're actually done with that cell. So I could click on this, right-click, remove that highlighting, and we can move on to our third cell, our third and final cell. Ooh, very exciting. So I click on that right there. Click on the little bit of yellow. Okay, we're going to run the exact same code because it's the same definition of the expression column, right? So what are we going to do in here? Well, the very first piece is the calculate revisor. Anytime you see a revisor, in particular calculate, any of them really, but especially calculate, you want to, in your mind's eye, freeze that subexpression to remind yourself it's only going to run after we revise the filters, right? So it's not the first that runs. It only happens after we revise the filters. So I'm going to right-click and go find a nice blue color to freeze it. Brr, cold. Okay, good. So we've frozen the subexpression. Calculate says, I want to run this after I revise the filters. To revise the filters, I'm going to do 2 things, right? Or try and do 2 things. If there's any values in the current row, I'm going to add them as filters, current row filtering, also known as context transition. If there are any override filters provided as additional arguments to calculate, I'm going to add those. Okay, let's do this first bit first. Are there any values in the current row? Yeah, sure are. Dish equals salad. Okay, let's go add that as a filter and perform current row filtering. Dish equals salad, right? So we take that. Calculate says, there's that value of the current row. I'm going to move it and into the filter context. I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy of it. Again, it's more accurate to say it moves it, but I like to see it both in the filter context. I also like to see it right there. Okay, good. So we've performed current row filtering, taking salad and adding it to the filters. Now we're going to ask, are there any override filters? Well, no. Calculate only has 1 argument in this little bit of code. If there were 2 or 3 or 4 arguments, we would have to add some additional override filters, right? But we don't have any, so there's no override filters to add. So guess what? We're all done revising the filters. This is our revised filter context within which we're going to run this sub-expression. So let's filter down to salad. Filter down to salad. Good. So now we've got our filter context in place. I could go ahead, or I should say calculate can go ahead. I'm not going to do anything. Calculate's going to do it. Calculate's going to unfreeze the sub-expression and run it in this new revised filter context. So I'm going to right-click, click on the little color right there. I'm going to give it this nice light gray color. It's unfrozen. I guess there's maybe a little puddle behind it. It's unfrozen, right? And now we can go ahead and run it. So we go get all the visible rows of mini, add this column to it, sum up the results. So I go ahead and scoop those up. This time it's just that 1 row for salad. Click down there, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values. Click OK. We're going to add this column to it and sum up the results. And I've already got that ready for us, so I type in EXP, and as soon as I hit enter, it adds that column for every single row it gets the units. So 1 is right there, that's the units, and it sums up the results. And if you're not good at math, I can help you out here. 1 plus nothing else is just the number 1. Okay, so that number 1 is going to get populated right there. It's what calculate returns, right? It's the answer. But Calculate's not done yet. If you remember, Calculate's a very good roommate, like all the revisers. It's done evaluating the sub-expression. It can go set the filter context back to the way it found it. So I'm going to click on that little patch of orange right there, Control-C to copy, and select that, Control-V to paste. That's my way of erasing that filter, right? So Calculate has set the filters back to the way that it found it, right? And now this cell is all done right here. So I'm going to right-click, click No Fill right there, right? And I'm going to unfilter this as well. There we go. The filters are back to the way it found it. Now we're done adding this column to the table. We've got answers for every single row. So I'm going to go ahead and unhighlight this. We're all done adding the column. That bit's all finished. And now it's the last easy bit, right? We've got a temp table. We've added a column to it. What is average X going to do? It's going to average the results. So it's going to take the average of those. So I'm going to click average. So I'm going to double click on average right there. I'm going to select those values right there. Add closing parentheses and hit enter. And I get 4, right? Which, by the way, is the average number of units per dish that we sold. Okay. So lots of stuff, but you can see it's a very repetitive kind of process right here. And the more you do it, the simpler it becomes. Okay, well, I do sure hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.